And setting up the webinar. Perfect. Okay. We are live. I'm just waiting for I can see everyone. Great. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to start letting everyone in. This is so exciting. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to wait for a moment or so, and we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Please feel free to share your name, your pronouns, and your location, where you're from, and also what brings you here to learn about Gloria Naylor, the Gloria Naylor. Please feel free to just type away in the chat. We'll be getting started in a moment or so. Oh, thank you so much, Julia Hendricks. She, her, always happy to hear and see a Black woman writer celebrated. Thank you so much. Yes. Hi, Marquita D. Foster, she, her, hers, Texas. Love her writing. Thank you. Yes, thank you for sharing. We're going to wait another minute or so for more people to come in. Thank you to everyone on our YouTube live. Thank you so much for being here. Hi, Sophia Fleming. You are a master's PhD student. You study Black women in rhetoric. I'm a huge fan of Gloria Naylor, and she is an amazing Black writer. Thank you so much, Sophia. Wow, a lot of Gloria Naylor fans up in here. I see y'all. Okay, so I know more people are going to be coming in, but I just want to get the event started so that we can give our wonderful panelists and guests the time to talk about Gloria Naylor, which we could do for days. It would take the whole year. Yeah, I would love to get started. Oh, someone said, joining from Wisconsin, excited to hear more about Gloria Naylor's archive and connections. And I hear you, Grandy, Naylor Hive is strong. It is strong, very, very strong. So my name is Jamie Swift. I am the executive director of Black Men Radicals. It's really so nice to have everyone here. I know more people are coming in to learn about the life, legacy, scholarship, writing, and leadership of Gloria Naylor. Once again, I've been hyped for this event all day, given the events that are happening in our nation. And I just want to acknowledge that particularly Black and Brown and people of color are going through heightened stress, disbelief, cognitive dissonance, and just, angst with life right now. And we just want to honor that space and also give us space to be safe and to get our minds off on certain things that are happening in our world. And what better way to come together and celebrate a prolific writer such as Gloria Naylor, who touched on these topics. And you will learn about these. You will learn about that today through our wonderful guests and panelists who are going to lead a powerful discussion on her life and legacy. So before we get started, I always platform or center the conversation to note that this is a safe space, right? And we do not allow any white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, queerphobia, ableism. We don't allow that in our conversations. And if you cannot abide by that safe space, I will have to kick you out. So please enjoy the conversation. Please feel free to share in the comments why you're here, what brings you here, why do you love Gloria Naylor? And we're excited to be here with you. So next up, I will be introducing our wonderful panelists for this event who comprise the Gloria Naylor Archive, or the board of the Gloria Naylor Archive. And so let's get into it because we have some powerhouse scholars leading this conversation. So first and foremost, we have Suzanne Edwards. Suzanne Edwards, PhD, coordinates the processing and digitization of archival materials, as well as the 2021 symposium. The PI of the Naylor Accelerator, she is also an associate professor in the English department and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program at Lehigh University. Her scholarship on Gloria Naylor has been published in Chaucer Review and African American Review with Trudaire Harris. So thank you so much, Suzanne, for being here. So next up, we have Mary Foltz. Mary Foltz is an associate professor of English at Lehigh University. Her book, Contemporary American Literature and Experimental Culture, American Shit, Palgrave 2020, includes a chapter on Linden Hills that explores how Naylor uses scatological imagery to address constructions of race and the impact of racism. In 2019, Foltz worked with Lehigh team members to secure grant funding to digitize portions of the Naylor Archive and to organize a symposium focused on how the archive opens up new directions for Gloria's scholarship. Foltz's current research attends to bibliographies in the Naylor Archive, which Naylor developed as she wrote her renowned novels. Foltz also is working with Maxine Lavon Montgomery and Suzanne Edwards to produce an edited collection of Naylor scholarship inspired by the archive. So thank you so much, Mary, for being here. Ayana Woods is the Gloria Naylor Archive's research assistant for the 2020-2021 academic year. Ayana is currently processing archival materials, managing social media for the archive, and assisting with planning and organization for the Naylor Archive Symposium later this year. Ayana earned her BA in English from Howard University, HU, you know, and will receive an MA in Literature with a focus in social justice in 2021. Her research centers Black women writers and non-traditional models of literary criticism and memory work. Ayana, thank you for being here. I had to shout out HU because that's just how it is, I'm sorry. And last but not least, we have Randy Gill Sadler. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Randy is not last, but we have Randy Gill Sadler, PhD, who is an assistant professor of English at Lafayette College. Her scholarly and teaching interests include African American and Afro-Caribbean women's literature, US empire, and Black feminist theory. She is currently working on a book manuscript that shifts the geography of the Black women's literary renaissance to the real and fictional islands in June Jordan, Paul Marshall, and Todi K. Babara, and Gloria Naylor's literary work to assert that African Americans' growing participation in US empire in the 1970s and 1980s was the central political aesthetic concern for Black women writers. Gill Sadler has discussed her ongoing work on Naylor on the Electric Maroonage podcast and the Arizona State University Black Ecologies discussion series. Randy, thank you so much for being here. And last but not least, we have Stephanie Powell-Watts. Stephanie Powell-Watts is the author of No One Is Coming to Save Us, winner of the 2018 NAACP Image Award in Fiction, the inaugural selection of the American Library Association Award, and the 2017 Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writer Selection. Her fiction has been honored with the Ernest Jane Gaines Award for Excellence, a Whiting Award, and was a finalist for the PEN/Hemingway Award. Her fiction and essays have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, BBC International, and the 2020 Best American Essays. So thank you so much for everyone for being here. And I'm gonna give it away to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for that wonderful introduction. And especially thank you, Dr. Swift, for your dedicated work and vision and leadership with Black women radicals. I know we're all super excited to be here today to share information about Gloria Naylor's archives and to invite your engagement with those materials. I'm just going to share my screen here to give you a little bit of information. This is where you can visit the archive and online and some of what you'll find there. My role here today is to give a broad overview of Gloria Naylor's life and works. I know we've got a lot of fans here, so I trust that you won't mind a quick tour through some of your favorites. And my focus really specifically will be on how the archive enriches our understanding of her creative, intellectual, and political vision. Gloria Naylor was born in New York City in 1950, although, as she often remarked, her life started in Tunica County, Mississippi, where her parents lived until very shortly before her birth. After she graduated from high school, she did missionary work as a Jehovah's Witness in New York City, North Carolina, and Florida, supporting herself as a switchboard operator. In 1975, she returned to New York City, enrolled in CUNY Brooklyn College, and graduated with a degree in English literature. While she was at CUNY, she wrote her first and perhaps best known novel, The Women of Brewster Place, published in 1982. Over the next 10 incredibly productive years, she published 3 more novels, Linden Hills, Mama Day, and Bailey's Café. Each of these novels is distinct. Naylor called The Women of Brewster Place her, quote, emotional novel, Linden Hills her intellectual novel, Mama Day her spiritual novel, and Bailey's Café her sexual novel. At the same time, the quartet works together as a whole, with primary characters from one novel appearing as secondary characters in another. She returned to Brewster Place in 1998 with the Men of Brewster Place, and later in 2005 wrote a fictionalized memoir called 1996. Gloria Naylor is best known for these novels, which speak to social and political issues that remain urgent today: migration and gentrification, religion and sexuality, racism and sexism in higher education, capitalism and globalism, the enduring legacies of enslavement and colonization in North America, as well as the power of Black joy, cultural traditions, and resistance. Her archive is documents that she collected between 1979 and 2007. And those documents provide a lens for understanding her extraordinary literary achievements in the broader context of her radical Black thought, politics, and aesthetics. In this sense, Naylor's archive is, like her novels, a creative achievement. Sorry, and there's her novels you can see. So the archive is, I think, like her novels, the archive itself is a creative achievement. And again, like her novels, Naylor designed the archive itself as a public resource by donating it to Sacred Heart University in 2009. The archive is extensive, and you can actually see part of it behind me here. We have 54 boxes of this size, which is a pretty significant amount of material. And it has a variety of different kinds of materials. There's correspondence with other writers, activists, and scholars. There are annotated research materials that she compiled in the process of writing her novels. There are drafts of her published novels and of unpublished works. There's documentation about the film production company she founded in the 1990s. There are notes about courses she taught at any one of a number of visiting positions she held. And there are journals about her writing process and about her travels. So to give a sense of the range of materials in the archive, I just want to very briefly highlight 3 different documents with a few words about what they have to tell us, both about Gloria Naylor herself and also how they respond to the question that Dr. Swift posed for us today. And that question was, how can Naylor's archives give critical insights to our current political climate and to the transformative and new futures to come? So the first thing I'm going to start with, this is just an example of a letter. Almost a third of the collection is correspondence, which Ayana knows very well because she has been working hard on documenting that correspondence over the last year. Those letters are from fans, they're from friends and family, they're from publishers and editors, from organizations offering fellowships, residencies, and awards. And Naylor was scrupulous with her correspondence. She kept copies not only of the letters that were coming to her, but also of the letters that she was sending in response, or in some cases, sending first. Perhaps most striking is the correspondence she maintained, often over decades, with other writers, artists, activists, and intellectuals. So, for example, there are letters she exchanges with Lucille Clifton, with Nikki Giovanni, with Julia Alvarez, Ann Petrie, Gloria I. Joseph, Miriam Jimenez Roman, Oke Ndibe, and Novello Nelson, among many others. And for now, I just want to highlight one small corner of that extensive correspondence. Her exchanges with Indian feminist writers, Amu Joseph and Nobonita Devshen, as well as editor and publisher Unjum Kuttal. In 1985, Naylor toured India with the United States Information Agency's public diplomacy program. As part of that tour, she gave lectures on African-American literature, read from the Women of Brewster Place and Linden Hills, and met with Indian writers, activists, and intellectuals. For Naylor, the reception her novels found with Indian audiences, the Indian writers she met and whose work she encountered, and the relationships this two-week visit fostered proved influential. In a letter to her longtime editor, Cork Smith, Naylor observed that the trip had shifted her perspective in many ways. She wrote, "For the first time in my life, I've heard my work and that of other Black Americans discussed for exactly what it is, literature. These misguided souls see no contradiction in the Black and American experience, concomitantly in Black and American literature. It's odd I had never considered what I have to bear at home, a weight until someone lifted it off." And in her formal report for USIA, Naylor observed that the most rewarding aspect of her trip was her informal conversations with Dalit women and Dalit women writers, as well as tours that illuminated economic disparities between hostels for Dalit women and private country clubs for elites. Her visit to Mumbai included a seminar discussion comparing the work of Dalit women writers in India and Black women writers in the US. This was particularly useful, she wrote, quote, "since Bombay is the nucleus of an emerging feminist movement in India," end quote. This visit spurred ongoing communication with Amu Joseph, for example, who published reviews of Naylor's books in the Indian Post for years to come. The letters among Naylor and her Indian correspondence suggest one way that the transnational coalitions we can see in her novels had correlates in her own personal experiences. The island setting of Mama Day, as the late Cheryl Wall has argued, reimagines white supremacist patriarchal narratives of national founding in matriarchal Afrocentric terms. Bailey's Café is a liminal space at the edge of the world, a transnational community that appears for those who need it wherever they are, in California, in Ethiopia, in Germany, and in Brooklyn. And in Naylor's unpublished and unfinished draft of a novel called Sapphira Wade, migratory birds, like people who migrate both by force and by choice, cross the globe in ways that challenge national and continental boundaries. Perhaps like the island Willow Springs in Mama Day, and like Bailey's Café, Naylor's letters, which also crisscross the globe, suggest new possibilities for political coalitions across national borders. So that's just one tiny corner of some correspondence. And now I'm going to turn to a screenplay that Naylor wrote in 1998. Naylor wrote this screenplay, which was called Parchment on Spec for a Developer. And it was sold to TNT, but the project was never cast, never produced, and certainly never broadcast. This screenplay, set in Jackson, Mississippi in 1937, follows the intertwined stories of two women unjustly incarcerated in Parchman Prison, which remains in operation today. As Naylor writes in her research notes for the screenplay, her aim in writing the screenplay is historical and political, to show in primetime television how convict leasing was and is a, quote, functional replacement for slavery, end quote. And in telling that story, Naylor characteristically focused on the distinctive experiences of Black women who were forced to work in the cotton fields, textile factories, and superintendent's home at Parchman. The screenplay follows a friendship between Alberta, a mother who is arrested on a manufactured charge of prostitution while she's on her way home from choir practice, and Precious, who was born in the prison. When Precious realizes she's pregnant and Alberta learns that her appeal has been denied, they escape together. Alberta in search of the home she lost, and Precious seeking the one she's just begun to imagine. Parchment speaks to Naylor's political investment in addressing the violence of mass incarceration, particularly for Black women. And in doing so, it draws our attention back to the representations of state violence against Black people that we see in her published novels. Women of Brewster Place, for instance, also explores how the policing of Black men affects Black women, as Maddie Michaels ultimately loses both her home and her son when she finances his bail. And in Bailey's Café, Sadie's arrest for prostitution by an officer who recognizes her extreme need but lacks compassion for it leads her to lose her home. And that scene in Bailey's Café anticipates some of what we see in a different register in Parchment. With Parchment, we can better appreciate Naylor's work as part of other Black women radicals activist work. Kimberly Crenshaw's Say Her Name with the African American Policy Forum, and Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. In that, Naylor is calling attention to the specific experiences of Black women in the context of mass incarceration and state violence. Parchment also reflects Naylor's long-standing interest, not just in writing novels, but in producing plays and films, as well as the structural barriers she faced in getting that work produced. In 1989, Naylor's The Women of Brewster Place was adapted as a two-part miniseries with Oprah Winfrey. And in letters, Naylor expresses her satisfaction with that miniseries, which received critical acclaim at the time and even more recently. But she also expressed her horror at a short-lived weekly television comedy based on characters from The Women of Brewster Place. And as a result of her sort of dissatisfaction with that adaptation of her characters, beginning with her contract for Linden Hills, Naylor insisted on maintaining creative control of any adaptations of her work. And she founded her own film production company, which she called One Way Productions, I'm assuming her way, in 1990. She worked for years on a screenplay for Mama Day, sent innumerable inquiries to other producers about funding, including Harvey Weinstein, and even began to reach out to actors who she wanted to cast in the film. You'll be as excited as Naylor was, I think, to learn that Lawrence Fishburne had read the script and confirmed his interest in playing George in Mama Day. The archival documentation about One Way Productions, Naylor's screenplays, most of which remain unproduced, and her theatrical scripts, including one of Bailey's Café, which was directed by Novella Nelson in 1994, show us that Naylor was a novelist as well as a producer, a screenwriter, and a playwright. This aspect of Naylor's career provides another context for her representations of film, television, and stage in her novels. In Bailey's Café, Bailey takes his soon-to-be wife Nadine to the movies in a scene that draws on Naylor's extensive research about Oscar Michaud, the independent Black filmmaker who made more than 45 movies for Black audiences with all Black casts in the first half of the 20th century. Okay, so that's number 2. And then here we have number 3. And I want to end this very brief overview of the types of documents that you can find in the Naylor Archive with a quick look at a document that doesn't easily translate into a narrative about Naylor's life. It doesn't easily translate into an interpretation or context for the novel. This particular scrap of paper, of which there are many in the archive, many of them on Post-it notes or the backs of other work or in the margins of newspapers. This particular one is entitled White Friends and is organized with the material from Women of Brewster Place, even though it doesn't have any clear relationship to the novel. But the archive is filled with these ephemera of ordinary life, of a creative mind at work. There are paging cards for libraries in Brooklyn, sketches, phone message logs. And these materials are also important records, I think, reminders of what we can and cannot learn from her archive. Naylor's novels are filled with Black women who encounter lost archives, only to find that the documents don't have the answers they need. In Linden Hills, Willa Nadeed, imprisoned in a basement with her dead child, finds the archival traces her predecessors left behind. Marginal comments in a family Bible, a recipe book, a family photo album. But the previous Nadeed wives disappear, literally, in one case, from the documents that record their lives. Mama Day recovers the deed recording the enslavement of her ancestor, Sapphira, from attic eaves. But the water has so badly damaged the document that she can't read it, and she ultimately finds Sapphira in her dreams. These moments speak to the different ways in which documents can obscure the lives of the Black women they purport to record, and the ways in which Black women's own archives have so often been buried. And this seems like a good place for me to just end and throw it over to Stephanie, but I'll say, like, I've come to see so much of what's challenging to interpret in the Naylor Archive as potentially part of its creative design. It calls our attention to the epistemic violence, the purposeful omissions, and the limitations of archival documents. The receipts, the appointment books, the 1 or 2 word notes scribbled on a Post-it point to the fullness of a life and a creative vision that leaves only faint traces in the written record. So I'm going to give this over to my colleague and a novelist in her own right, Stephanie Watts.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be part of this panel. And thank you, Suzanne, that was fantastic. So much that I had not known. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my encounters with the archive. I first got to know Gloria Naylor's writing when I was an undergraduate student in the 90s. And my professor was Dr. Sandra Govan, and she introduced me to a lot of Black women writers that were doing some beautiful and necessary work and were almost completely unknown to the general public. This was when Naylor was becoming a force. Oprah had chosen her work, and so she was rising, but there were many others that were not known. But I loved her novels immediately, her erudition, her knowledge of Western literature, alongside her own voice and experience, her sense of play, her commitment to the ancestors as the foundation of Black empowerment and liberation, and her boldness in asserting that her own work with other literary luminaries has force and beauty and value. And all of that gave me permission and encouragement to try to live that boldness too. I learned later that, like me, Naylor had been a Jehovah's Witness in her early years, and that sealed my bond with her. One of the things that I saw in the archive that I loved is she writes, "I believed in what I was doing when I was a JW. I had found a way to order my existence and the existence of the world, and I wanted to pass that on to people. Did I feel as if I were called? In a way, the calling was a need within me to touch and to be touched beyond the flesh. So what went wrong? Was I caught up so much in form, I forgot content? I think that's the problem with most religions. There must be ritual, and in the ritual, you forget the reason." This section provides both a blessing and a critique of what was Naylor's profound spiritual experience. She recognized that religion in her opened a singular and hard to reproduce consciousness, and a way to be touched by the flesh, as she says. Like my friend and writer Lee Upton has said, that the value of a childhood steeped in religious experience is the very real expectation that suffering will be redeemed. The method of that redemption, however, is the question, and was the question for Naylor. And we see this over and over again. The first book I read was Linden Hills of Naylor's. It's a story all about the road to redemption or not. It's an ambitious novel in conversation with Dante's Divine Comedy, particularly the Inferno section, and tells the story of how to lose grace, what it means to live without it, and what happens when the inevitable fire comes. Naylor's intention was to chronicle the result of when we as a people eschew our true path for the wide and spacious road to assimilation, self-hate, and spiritual hell. She also writes, "The people of El Hills are in hell because they gave up eternal life within the sanctuary of their culture. They deliberately chose to cut the ties that bound them to a history." She creates in the form of character and narrative the essence of James Baldwin's view: do we really want to be integrated into a burning house? Reading Naylor's journal entries from the archive has deepened my attachment to both Gloria Naylor and to Linden Hills, and especially to the writing process and how the art of writing, while not always an exercise in autobiography, incorporates the whole individual. I don't know that an archive is the first source that we think of when we think about the work that creative writers do. But of course, they provide so much for us in terms of material, but also they're wonderful aids to understanding and appreciating the works of the writers that we love. For example, in the popular imaginary, we think about the writer struck by the lightning of inspiration, dictating a story directly from the muses. Naylor's journal entries show the hard-fought process of getting a story on the page. Writing is useful work, and her journal entries recognize both parts of this description. It is both useful and it is work. She writes, "My problem now is concentration and discipline. I am aware of the shortness of time in relation to the volume of work, and I must make the best use of it." In July '81, she says, "I could be working on Linden Hills. I should be working on Linden Hills, because in a few months when I'm over my head in graduate work, I know I'll look back at these wasted days and start moaning, why? I feel like this is a sentiment that every writer everywhere has said, why? The false starts, the entropy, the languishing in the notion of what I should be doing. And she also talks about the other element of that, and that is the fear. And that's what keeps so many of us as writers stuck. She says on October 17th, '81, "I keep running in circles in order to avoid what is really at the root of my being, and it's still fear. I'm afraid that El Hills will be a boring book." She says on October 25th, "I'm going to put El Hills aside for now. Last night I reread some of what I wrote overseas and what I did here in New Haven. The work is horrible. I have to remember that what I wrote was consciously a first draft, but I can't stand seeing my work like that." These bouts of sometimes confidence, followed sometimes inexplicably by bouts of insecurity, are the script for most writers' lives. Everybody feels it, everybody suffers it, and everyone thinks that she's the first and the only. I think it's a gift when a writer of her caliber, we see that battle on the page and her emotions raw. By June 1983, she has a different feeling about the book. She writes, "El Hills has been such a bitch. Each step of the way has been uphill, but I still want what I wanted when I started it. I want it to be a good book. I want each paragraph, each section to be the best I feel I can do. I know it will be finished. I feel it in my guts now." Linden Hills was many years in the making, and it was published in 1985. The other thing I'm really excited about is in looking at the archive, is seeing her thinking about some of the big issues that writers are talking about right now. And in recent years, the idea of whether or not a woman can be what is sometimes called an art monster has been debated, has been thrown about. And the art monster is usually a man, and he is an artist who is first and foremost concerned with his art. They live for it, they value nothing over it, and they value nothing over the expression of their own genius. Many famous male artists have had mothers and wives and lovers who take care of their needs, who do all of the background work, all the domestic drudgery necessary to keep the place going. Nabokov famously didn't lick his own stamps. So you multiply these duties and this emotional labor by many factors if there are children involved. The question is, can a woman be this kind of artist? Or as the poet says, do you always have to choose between perfection in life over perfection in art? The writer Jenny Ophel says, the female writers I know yearn to be more monstrous. They say it in offhand, ha 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 ways. I wish I had a wife. What does that mean, really? It means you wish to abandon the task of nurturing in order to perform the selfish sacraments of being an artist. 40 years ago, this tug and pull was clearly going on in Naylor's thinking and in her journey as an artist, and not just an artist, but one with a megaphone for the stories of an overwhelmed and besieged people. One of my favorite quotes is, she says, I guess I've chosen me over children, husbands, mortgages. Lovers and friends are fine. They can be kept in compartments and at a distance, but not the type of love that has molded and nourished you, will mold and raise you to nourish. Of course, there are many accomplished writers who are mothers and wives, but even this young writer, and at the time that she wrote this, she was about 31. Even that young, she was aware of what is at stake when a woman prioritizes her art. Another one of the gifts that I've loved to see in Naylor's own thinking and in her own hand is she's thinking often about time. She writes on January 1st, 2000, I love this line, I rarely travel enough for pleasure, and during the next 50 years, I'm going to do more of that. And in the following 50, I'll be traveling through the stars. But most of her thinking about time is not about the time left in her life. She recognized that gets spooled out and cut off in ways that nobody can predict. But the granular understanding of what time is day to day, the surety that it is with what you do in those moments that you get things written, that you get things finished, that you become the artist that you want to be. There are many wonderful discoveries in these journal entries and in the archive, but one that gave me a thrill was seeing early on that Naylor knew that writing was her life's work, her art, and even her calling. This is October 17th, 1981. She says, I have fallen in love because I was told women fall in love. I've come to Yale because I was told bright women come to Yale. I have worshiped God because I was told worshiping God buys you a pass go over the coffin. Always obedient, listening to the clamor. What have I ever done because I told myself to do it? I have written. Thanks.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
I'm sorry, that's Mary. So I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, Suzanne. Oh, it's so great to be on this panel and to hear your comments today. And I have already heard Ayanna Woods and Dr. Randy Gill-Sadler's, some of their work in the archive. So I know what's coming next and it's going to be great. And I'm so happy to be here and share some thoughts about the Naylor Archives today. I also just wanted to thank Dr. Jamie Swift for organizing this panel. Thank you so much. What a treat and a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate your labor to get us all here together on this panel. I also just wanted to thank at the beginning, working in the Naylor Archives for the past 3 years, I have been incredibly grateful to work with a great team from Sacred Heart University, Lehigh University, and a variety of other faculty and graduate students that have invested time and labor in the archives to digitize material that Naylor collected and to process that material to make it accessible to you, to fans of Naylor, and to scholars of Naylor's work. So I'm just deeply grateful for that full team. And of course, I want to say I'm just grateful for Gloria Naylor for all of the labor and time that she put into putting these archives together. And I like to invoke her. I think that sometimes we think of the literary critic as analyzing or performing some kind of criticism. I think it can also be an act of service in celebration of someone who's brought great literary gifts into the world. And I thank her for everything that she left to us, from her literary works to this incredible archival material. Okay, so for our panel today, I'm going to share about some archival material that Naylor collected as she wrote Linden Hills in an effort to showcase some rich avenues for greater understanding of that second novel. And I'll just give a quick summary of the novel, just for those that haven't read it in a while. Naylor's second novel, Linden Hills, focuses on an affluent Black community situated next to a Black working class community. The primary characters in the novel are Willie and Lester, two youth who take odd jobs in the affluent community in order to make money to buy Christmas gifts for their loved ones. Naylor's two characters, one working class and one middle class, move through the suburb in the novel and encounter Black patriarchs like Luther Needed that promote wealth, property acquisition, and separation from Black working class communities. And they do so because Luther Needed believes that Black working class communities threaten his property values and those of others in Linden Hills. And he also believes that Black working class communities are a threat to his success in the United States. So as Willie and Lester travel through Linden Hills, Naylor also offers readers a parallel narrative of Black women who married Luther Needed, the founder of the community, and his sons, also named Luther. The stories of these women are narrated by Willa Needed, who is locked in a basement, as Stephanie just reminded us, by her husband with her young son, as punishment for producing a child that is not the exact replica of his father. As Willa is imprisoned in the basement, she uncovers archival material, cookbooks and photo albums, and a Bible with handwritten notes that speak to the stories of Black women left out of dominant historical accounts of Linden Hills that celebrate Black men as leaders. By focusing her novel through Willie and Willa as they reflect upon Linden Hills, its history and its present, Naylor calls readers to center the stories of Black women and Black working class communities that not only are typically left out of state archives, but also can be left out of Black patriarchal histories. So as you may know, Gloria Naylor began writing Linden Hills before she entered the graduate program at Yale in African American Studies in 1981. In the summer before beginning the graduate program, Naylor visited Cadiz and Tangier prior to traveling to Yale. And during her travels and her time in the graduate program, she wrote brief journal entries, which are contained in the archive. And Stephanie already kind of addressed some of those journal entries. The journal entries provide glimpses into her writing process, the struggles that she had balancing creative work with academic work, her thoughts on her weight loss during this period, and tantalizing discussions of the interventions that she hoped Linden Hills would make. And on this last point, I want to read a passage from her journal in which she shares her early thinking about the Linden Hills book project. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here so you can see this, this passage from her journal. So here's her journal entry. And she writes of Linden Hills, what she's trying to accomplish. I just really wanted to symbolically put the Black middle class into hell, a community of 9 circular drives with Luther Needed being the center. I want to try and transmit the tenor in the fact that such a man could starve his wife and child to death in the basement funeral home. Why does he do it? Because he is to be the ultimate concentration of the disenfranchisement and powerlessness that characterizes the rest of the community. The people of Linden Hills are in hell because they gave up eternal life within the sanctuary of their culture. They deliberately chose to cut the ties that bound them to a history, an ethnicity, and they are striving to out-ape the naked ape. They pattern their values, morals, and aspirations after a dying and sick society, white American society. And then they are the reflection of nothing. And they will suffer in Linden Hills. They will suffer because their negligence is spelling the death of a people, the social retardation of a people they should be reaching back and helping. And with this stunting of the physical being of these people, they also stunt their souls in Linden Hills, in hell. In this journal entry, Naylor reveals her major interventions in her novel. She wants to show how the Black middle class's aspirations are shaped by a sickness in white America, a sickness in nation building and in capitalism. For Naylor and others, the deep history of racial formations in the US depend upon the exclusion of Black communities from full citizenship and limit their participation in capitalism. In the history of the Luther Needed family, she shows how the post-emancipation period continued to treat Black communities as second-class citizens, and how the types of employment for working-class Black people continue to be limited to sawmills and the tar pit. Those are the two forms of employment available in the novel Linden Hills in the early part of the community formation. The Needed family's economic success depends upon, in the early years, renting shacks to working-class Black families and burying their loved ones. Yet as the community grows, their aspirations, like Needed's families, are shaped by a desire to ascend, to move beyond the critical knowledge of ancestors who understood racial capitalism to depend upon the creation of low-wage labor and surplus labor that allow wealth to be accrued by managerial and ruling classes. Her book project then is to show how empty subjects become when they disavow their history and the wisdom of their ancestors and communities in favor of an embrace of capital. For her, for Naylor, eternal life comes through the sanctuary of community, not through the collection of material goods and wealth. We can see in this passage how Naylor already understood her project as a critical take on a popular celebration of the Black middle class as a vanguard of progress, success, and the promise of social and economic justice. So too, the Naylor Archive reveals that her anti-capitalist novel is deeply engaged with mid-century Black patriarchal academic studies that celebrate the Black middle class. In her archives, Naylor includes a typed bibliography of academic sociological and historical texts created during the Linden Hills period. Now, for most of her novels following Linden Hills, the archive also contains other typed bibliographies, and we assume that all but one of these was typed by Naylor herself. To be clear, I don't know the extent to which Naylor delved into all of the books on her bibliographies. She may have skimmed some, she may have tossed some away, she may have spent hours and pored over other texts on these bibliographies. However, because she mentions a number of these texts explicitly in her novel Linden Hills, we can use this bibliography as a starting point for understanding the academic conversations in which she saw herself intervening. So attention to her bibliography, which I'm showing you here on the screen, shows that Naylor was invested in intervening into intellectual history, and in particular, her aesthetic work challenges Black patriarchal sociological and historical scholarship focused on the middle class. So as you can see in the overview section of this bibliography, she lists 9 separate works that she consulted, including texts by well-known mid-century academics like E. Franco and Fraser, renowned intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, and then lesser known figures like Richard Bardolph, who's listed on the top of this bibliography. The majority of the 9 books included in the overview address the Black middle class, discuss their successes, as well as theorize the reasons for their economic achievement, and forward understandings of their position in the US economy. While some of the texts that Naylor read remain highly critical of narratives about the Black middle class, others maintain an investment in celebrating members of the Black middle class as models for achievement in the US and as representatives of new possibilities at mid-century for class mobility, despite consistently acknowledging the continued threat of institutionalized racism to economic success within the nation. As a corrective to texts written by men and focused primarily on Black men in the middle class, Naylor's novel ultimately provides an important Black feminist vision of how capitalist notions of subjects' value are grounded in racialized and gendered understandings of labor, how competition between laborers that is central to capitalism distorts subjects' relationship to themselves and to others, and also how a focus on individual financial success ultimately betrays the need for a structural critique of economic systems that disenfranchise larger Black communities. So I want to just take one example from her bibliography that shows her project of intervening into mid-20th century intellectual history. And I'm going to focus on a text here that is Gilbert F. Edwards' The Negro Professional Class. It's published in 1959. In particular, this book is about, it is a study of occupational mobility and socioeconomic mobility of Black men working in the professional classes in the District of Columbia in the 20th century. And in particular, Edwards interviewed for his book 300 Black physicians, dentists, lawyers, and teachers in order to better understand the structures that supported their gainful employment and middle-class status, and to better understand social stratification within Black communities. And he concludes this occupational study, he concludes that the status of fathers in professional careers and the socioeconomic status the socioeconomic status of fathers has a large impact on the future success of sons. He also shows how sons' education, their family's financial resource, their parental educational history, all of this contributes to middle-class status. And then at the end of his study, he discusses respondents' motivations for seeking out particular career paths, with mention of how those surveyed did rule out specific careers like journalism, acting, or the other arts, including the literary arts, for fear that they could not earn a decent living from such work. So throughout his study, Edwards emphasizes a mid-century shift in which sons are not experiencing the same type of upward mobility as their fathers, and instead are finding themselves horizontally mobile into jobs that offer similar middle-class security. For Edwards, this means, and I'm quoting him here, a more crystallized stratification pattern is developing for Black people in the US. And further, he argues that, and I quote, professional occupations studied have in recent years recruited fewer persons of lower socioeconomic origin than was the case prior to World War I. So readers of Naylor's novel, Linden Hills, might sense here that her take on this problem revolves around increased competition among upwardly mobile citizens for limited spaces at the top for Black Americans, and an increased divide between middle class and working class Black communities. It is interesting when you read these books that Naylor read or has noted on her bibliography, how many of them are only interested in Black men in the middle class. And Edwards is a kind of exemplary of this point. He focuses his research only on male members of the middle class. And this really reveals sexism inherent in the study that Naylor clearly aims to undermine in Linden Hills. Edward writes of his method, and I'm quoting here, "It was necessary to select first a group of occupations in which males were highly represented. This condition was necessary if comparisons with other studies were to be made. Virtually every studied in the field has considered only the male population, with occupational transmission considered through the male line only. The logic of this selection is clear. Women have only recently entered the labor force in significant numbers. For a long period of our history, the role definition for this sex made a career subordinate to marriage and domestic duties," end quote. So here, rather than proposing to counter sexist studies with data that includes information about middle-class Black women workers, Edwards allows bias within previous studies to shape his own parameters, despite his acknowledgement of the increases in women workers during the time period of his study. And further, his claim that women only recently entered the labor force shows a lack of knowledge about or erasure of the deep history of Black women workers in domestic settings, agriculture, and factories. He may mean that only recently have large numbers, by mid-century, have large numbers of women workers received wages that might put them in the middle class. And in this way, he avoids addressing how racism and sexism impact Black women in educational institutions, on the job market, and then impacts their socioeconomic class.
So I've talked a lot about Edwards here, but I just want to give you a sense of what she was reading and how her novel is responding to those intellectual studies at mid-century, and how important then it was for her to center Black women and Black working class communities, in contrast to the Luther Needed and others in the community of Linden Hills. And I just want to close my comments just to recap a few arguments. Naylor's bibliography for Linden Hills helps us understand how her novel and her archival work are engaged with intellectual history. Naylor's bibliography reveals that she positions her novel in conversation and critique of Black patriarchal history and sociological studies that center the Black middle class and men within the Black middle class. While all of the authors on the bibliography are interested in addressing institutionalized racism, for Naylor, a limited focus on the middle class and Black men does not address visions of economic justice rooted in the wisdom and experiences of Black women and working class communities. Second, texts on Naylor's bibliography are committed to a certain kind of archival practice, or they're built from archives that center affluence, upward mobility, and masculine workers. Her novels and Naylor's archive challenge this focus. Her literary work attends to the stories of Black women and can be read as a fictional archival practice that counters Black patriarchal archival creation and narration. Her novels bring diverse stories about Black women to light as a way to counter the white supremacy of state archives and sexism of community archives. For her, academics of the mid-20th century were building exclusive archives through their studies that sidelined the life stories of Black women and working class people. Thus, the narratives that they create about social and economic justice are really limited because they're focused on the middle class alone. Her literary work and archival practice seeks to build new archives, fictional and actual, that explore the experiences of those typically not celebrated in mainstream academic circles. And their stories, their critiques of economic injustice, racism, and sexism are the ones that Naylor centers as a Black woman radical. Thank you so much for having me here today. And I want to introduce Ayanna Woods. You are going to love what she has to share with you. Ayanna, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Mary. That was great. Thank you so much for sharing about that. I love Linden Hills. So great to hear your research on that novel. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'll be talking today about Sapphira Wade, which is an unpublished manuscript in the archive. So excited to share this with you all. I know most of you probably have not heard of it before. It's pretty unknown. So yeah, let's just get into it here. So Sapphira Wade, this is actually a sketch right here from the archive of Sapphira Wade's face that Gloria Naylor did. This sketch is actually about 20 years older than this manuscript, which I love because it just shows how early on in her career this character was in Gloria Naylor's mind. So just some quick background about the manuscript. It's partial. We don't have the full manuscript. What we have contains about 2 chapters. It was written in 2004 by hand. So in the pictures I'll show you, you'll be seeing Gloria Naylor's handwriting and maybe some scratching out that she did, which is always cool for me. And it follows characters that you'll recognize if you read Mama Day. It begins, the first part, with Coco, one of the main characters from Mama Day, as an elder. She's 70 years old and returning to Willow Springs to learn her family history and the history of the island. And so for those of you who haven't read Mama Day, Willow Springs is a fictional island off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. And the second part follows the life and birth of Bascom Wade, follows him from his birth up until adolescence, where he eventually leaves his home in Norway. So Bascom Wade is actually the person who gave the island of Willow Springs to Sapphira Wade and her descendants under mysterious circumstances in 1823. So this manuscript starts with a descendant of Sapphira Wade going back to the island to uncover that history. How did they get the island? What does it mean that they have it? What happened? She wants to know her family's story. Let's talk about some themes of the island, of the manuscript. So history, I've already used that word like 10 times probably now, but this manuscript is all about history, what history means, people's different definitions of what history is. There's a lot of emphasis on embodied knowledge that is carried over from Mama Day, emphasis on community knowledge, emphasis on spiritual practice. Coco is really coming back to Willow Springs to figure out what kind of history is important to her, what kind of history was important to Mama Day, who was her great aunt and kind of the spiritual leader of her family. What kind of history was important to Sapphira Wade, and how they're all connected. So it starts with the story of her kind of finding her roots. There's a lot of interest on Coco's part in the gaps in her knowledge of her ancestors and her heritage, and she's trying to reclaim that story for herself and her children. This is a quote that I love from the manuscript. Here in Naylor's handwriting, you can see it says, "History ain't something that you find, baby girl, it's something that you are." And this is a moment where Coco's remembering what Mama Day had to say when she asked her about the history of the island. And this brings us to a point that I find really interesting in the manuscript, which is the juxtaposition of embodied history and kind of community history and institutionalized history. So, Coco asks Mama Day that question. She's trying to do research in a really formal, scholarly way. We later find out Coco went and got a PhD in history when she wanted to tell the story of Willow Springs. And Mama Day is kind of dismissive of that approach. She's like, you don't need to go and get a degree to figure out where you come from. In Mama Day, we learn of the other place, which is it's the place where Bascom Wade and Sapphira Wade lived. It's where they're buried as well. And in that house on the island, there's artifacts and the deed that Suzanne mentioned. And it's a very spiritual place, it's a very historical place, and a very sacred place. In Mama Day, very seldom does someone besides Mama Day get to go into the other place. It's a very special place. And we can kind of think of it in a way as the family's own archive, right? It's curated by the family, by the ancestors as they lived there, and kind of kept the way it was for the sake of not disrupting that history and the gravity of that history. Okay, so I want to talk about Coco talking about her experience trying to use the knowledge she acquired getting a PhD to tell the history of Willow Springs. It says, "She came back to school and became a historian, foolishly thinking that the skills she picked up at a university would enable her to write the history of the island for her dissertation. She found what she'd been told her whole life. Willow Springs didn't exist on any map. It was too small, only 49 square miles. And it didn't exist as a territory claimed by South Carolina or Georgia because the island sat right on the boundary between those two state lines. Well, if you can't go to the governmental archives for your information, then you go to the people." So that's something that's really important in this manuscript, is the people who experience the history, and it kind of tells us a lot about what Naylor feels is important in history keeping, record keeping, memory work, emphasizing experiential knowledge, knowledge that maybe wasn't accepted into institutions. And in a Black context, that means prioritizing her ancestors, her family, and what she knows. There's a beautiful moment where Coco returns to the graveyard where 4 generations of her family are buried and begins to speak with her ancestors, asking them to help her find the history of the island. And I'll read this here. She says, "I want you to talk to me," she says as she stands amid the gravestones. "I want the history of this family from your own mouths. I want to leave my children more than this land. I want to leave them the truth of their beginnings." So this is just like a sneak peek into what this document entails. It's a really beautiful spiritual journey for Coco, and it kind of mirrors in some ways. If you've read Mama Day, you'll know, like, you'll see similarities between the Bascom Wade section and Coco's life in Willow Springs. And it's all about exploring your roots and figuring out kind of your epistemological connections. What is knowledge to you? What is knowledge to this Black family descended from a woman who got this land mysteriously from the man who enslaved her? What is that history? How can Coco reclaim it as her own now that Mama Day, who was her kind of guide in this, is gone? So this brings me to, just want to talk about like some questions that this brings up for me when I read this document, and every time that I look at it again. First of all, this is like really one of the most beautiful things I've read by Naylor. If we had the whole book and it was published, I'm pretty sure it would be my favorite book by her. I wish we had the whole thing. But it always makes me think, what does all of this reveal about Gloria Naylor's ideas and beliefs about history and archives? What are her commitments? What does she value in terms of community archives versus institutionalized archives? What does she give weight to when considering sources of knowledge? What can we glean about what she's trying to say? What is she challenging about, you know, the ivory tower and getting a degree being, you know, considered in the society the best way to go about doing research and pursuing knowledge and all of that? What is Gloria Naylor saying about the real value of that when it comes to a community and a people's history, especially a Black community, a Black family's history, where their story was not told in these institutions, right? They're not even on a map. And so they have to go elsewhere for that information. And so I love the way this text interrogates that. And one thing it brings to mind for me as I'm working in the archive and working with Mary and Suzanne and our wonderful team here, is how can we who work with Gloria Naylor's archive uphold her wishes and abide by her beliefs, even as an institutionalized archive at a university, right? How can we prioritize community, prioritize Black stories, Black spaces, Black knowledge, even at a PWI, even at an institution, in a private institution, like Lehigh University? How can we really honor those commitments and mirror the commitments and beliefs about archival work and the value of Black stories, experiential knowledge that Gloria Naylor is really outlining in this novel and her research for it? So that's really what I have. This is how you can get in touch with the archive. I just, you know, had to put that there. So thank you all. Next we have Randy Gill-Sadler. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I love Randy's research. I'm so excited for y'all to hear what she has to say. So.
Thank you so much, Ayana, for that introduction, and thank you to Jamie for putting this together. This has been such a wonderful event. I'm learning even more from all of the panelists, and so I'm excited to share a bit of what I've been working with in terms of Gloria Naylor's archive. I just want to start off saying that it's interesting that Naylor describes Mama Day, which those archival materials will be the subject of my comments today. It's interesting that she described that novel as her spiritual novel, because one of the things that I've learned most explicitly from being in Gloria Naylor's papers is that our spiritual practices are knowledge practices, and that our sacred practices have intellectual stakes that we all must attend to. And so I will be talking about Gloria Naylor's research methods for creating the fictional island of Willow Springs, which is the setting of her third novel, Mama Day. I will be talking about Gloria Naylor's archive as a space that both addresses crises of Black life in the 1980s in island archipelagic geographies, but also the ways that she takes that crisis and rewrites it towards Black survival and Black livingness in her novel, Mama Day. And a lot of this work is centered in Southern geographies and Southern spaces, and that'll be a big part of what I say today. So I'll just get started, and I'm going to be moving back and forth between reading certain things and then talking through certain things. I'm not as prepared as my co-panelist with the PowerPoint, but I will be sharing my screen at different points so you can see some of the materials that I'm speaking about. So in 1968, Gloria Naylor was a senior in high school and had already been accepted into Hunter College as a freshman and decided not to go. Quote, they had assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1968, Naylor recalls. And his assassination left Naylor feeling that, quote, there was no hope in this system, in this country, for any kind of real change, quote. While many of Naylor's friends would join political organizations like the Black Panther Party for self-defense, Naylor opted to join the Jehovah's Witnesses, moving and living in North Carolina and Florida, as Suzanne mentioned. Naylor explains her decision to become a Jehovah's Witness as such, quote, I said through this organization, I would try to work for a better world because it wasn't just America. It was the whole planet I saw as disease in an odd kind of way. And this religion offered a philosophy that talked about the opposite. There would be a real government ruled by God, you know, and that would alleviate all the inequities all over the entire world. And that just sort of struck home for me at that time, end quote. At 18, Naylor understood the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. as one of several tragedies that constituted both a planetary and metaphysical crisis that exceeded the national scale. The solution then should have also exceeded national and global juridical reform and warranted a metaphysical revolution. Granted, one can certainly challenge whether Naylor's desire for a revolutionary theodicy was the correct solution. However, what I find promising here is Naylor's attention to the scale of the crises. While Naylor will ultimately leave the Jehovah's Witness organization claiming that, quote, the preached Armageddon hadn't come in 7 years and I needed other skills, end quote, Naylor's literary work will continue to ponder the limits of formal and higher education to solve planetary and metaphysical crises plaguing the Black community, and use the South and Southern geographies to point to non-hegemonic modes of study to address these crises. In discussing the fictional setting of her third novel, Mama Day, Gloria Naylor says in an interview, quote, I needed once again a landscape to demonstrate a state of mind, if you will, or a metaphysical situation. So I needed a place that was part of the United States, but not quite part of it, so there could be a bridge. I needed that, and the island was just perfect. I knew about those sea islands, end quote. And so in the 1980s, Naylor would return to the South again, this time seeking out the ways to explore the metaphysical situation that she seeks to portray in Mama Day. Before we had access to Gloria Naylor's materials, oftentimes scholars and literary critics speculated and argued that Naylor was in conversation with other Western canonical works, Shakespeare's The Tempest, and also other texts in the Black women's literary tradition like Sula, as well as Zora Neale Hurston. However, in her archival materials, what we've been able to see is that Gloria Naylor's fictional island of Willow Springs is a composite of several southern spaces, including Robinsonville, Mississippi, Mexico, and the Sea Islands themselves. So when Naylor would return to the South in 1983, she returned to her family's home of Robinsonville, Mississippi, to interview Eva McKinney, who was her grandmother's best friend as part of research for Mama Day. At the age of 83 years old, McKinney sharply narrates her childhood, her knowledge of midwifery and conjuring and healing, her 5 marriages, the birth of her children, and her firsthand accounts of the power of conjuring. Within this self-narration and oral history, Eva levies a strong critique of the myths of emancipation, inclusion, and white innocence. In seeking out Eva McKinney and returning to her family's ancestral home, Naylor is enacting a form of Black study and knowledge production in the social worlds that are described as inappropriate or unfit for academic and intellectual life. So I'm going to share my screen quickly to show you. Hold on, let me try that again. I'm going to share my screen to show you some of the transcript from that particular interview. In this interview, Eva McKinney never mentions any experiences of formal schooling or education. Eva McKinney actually narrates that her work as a laborer started at 7 years old, working on a cotton plantation. Despite not having any formal education, McKinney was indeed doing intellectual work and receiving lessons even within the context of the arduous labor of sharecropping. Eva recounts the breadth of her healing expertise: boil Jimson weed and add sugar and turpentine to it to quote unquote work children or stop them from being constipated. Wash and boil mayapple weeds to make tea that quotes work the cold out of you, end quote. She declares proudly at the end of this particular section of the interview, if the body gets down, I get the body up. When the body goes down, they would call on me. Here, McKinney's imaging of work in the body is not exclusively the backbreaking exploitative labor of sharecropping often associated with the Delta. Instead, Eva evokes a working of the body toward healing and restoration only made possible by a deep intellectual intimacy with the body and the earth. And it's also important here to note that in this interview, Eva McKinney and Gloria Naylor work as co-collaborators and co-conspirators. Eva is not the object of study for Gloria Naylor's work. Instead, she is an intellectual elder who makes Gloria Naylor's literary work possible. Okay, stop sharing here. In addition to revisiting Robinsonville, Mississippi, Naylor's fieldwork took her to the low country of South Carolina, specifically the Sea Islands. In working through Naylor's materials, she has a host of maps and tourism literature and texts that suggest that Naylor's visit to the Sea Islands was also to document the crises of Black dispossession of land in the Sea Islands in the 1980s, where tourist development projects in the archipelago threaten both African-American history and African-American futures. And so one of the examples of of those kind of documents that she was collecting is here. So this is a document that comes from the Hilton Head Island News Bureau, which is a program of the Hilton Head Island Chamber of Commerce. The Bureau highlights that the time traveling quality and nostalgia for the past that Daufuskie Island offers could be potentially destroyed if developments are enacted. The document notes that a large company has, quote, purchased approximately 40% of the island's 6,000 acres, and plans have been drawn for over 2,500 homes and villas, golf courses, and tennis courts, even a helicopter launching pad, end quote. The document goes on to suggest that the pending development might bring more jobs for residents, increase the standard of living, and encourage people who left Daufuskie for better economic opportunities to return, and result in, quote, families being reunited and the island economy being strengthened, end quote. The document also notes that many Daufuskians, most of whom are Black, quote, fear the development and are pessimistic about the promises of jobs, end quote. It is not clear how Naylor felt about this particular document. It doesn't contain any notes or traces of marginalia, nor does it Naylor seem to reflect on it in any of her correspondences. However, Naylor uses the communal narrator of Mama Day to critique the tourist developments across the Sea Islands. In the opening of the novel, the communal narrator explains that real estate developers are attempting to persuade the Willow Springs residents to sell their shoreland, promising that the development will assist with, quote, community uplift and better jobs. Not only do the Willow Springs residents decline the offers to sell their land because of a generational tradition that Mama Day enforces, but they also decline, citing what has happened to other islands within the archipelago. Quote, because it weren't about no them now and us later, was them now and us never. Hadn't we seen it happen back in the 80s on St. Helena, Daufuskie, and St. John's? Got them folks land, built fences around it first thing, and then brought in all the builder and high paid managers from Mainside. Ain't nobody on them islands benefited, end quote. While this document from the Hilton Head Island Bureau Naylor's papers is still anticipating what the outcome of the pending development on the island will be, Naylor's communal narrator, speaking in the future, 1999, has already seen the outcome. The developers purchased the land, create enclosures on the island, and the managers of the new jobs are from the mainland. The Black people are not visitors to the resorts. Instead, they, quote, clean toilets and cut the grass, end quote. The communal narrator reads this violent dispossession of and exploitation of Daufuskian people and the language that obscures that violence as a cautionary tale, quote, weren't gonna happen in Willow Springs, end quote. The lesson in observing what happened on the other islands is simple. Anything coming from beyond the bridge gotta be viewed real careful, end quote. In this instance, the community renders the economic plans and rhetoric of tourism as community uplift disingenuous and harmful when they are viewed under the critical eye of Black communal study. So while Naylor may not have critiqued these materials explicitly, she brings them under communal scrutiny in her novel in such a way that delegitimizes them as master texts that suggest colonial rule and exploitation of island spaces as an inevitability. And so here I'm really, I think it's really insightful the way that Naylor is also imagining alternative futures where the residents of the Sea Island Archipelago are not suffering under capitalist exploitation, but are able to mount a decolonial practice of not selling their land to mainside developers. But she does that through not only reimagining the future, but also reimagining the past through conjure work and through Black rural knowledge production. The last point that I want to speak about is that Naylor spent an extensive amount of time creating her fictional island of Willow Springs. In the archive, there are several lists handwritten list of all of the flora and fauna that will populate the island. There are also detailed lists of various kinds of folk knowledge, conjure knowledge, and hoodoo knowledge that she then uses to populate the novel itself. And I want to share one more of those with you. Hold on 1 second, I'm sorry. On this list, in Naylor's handwriting, it's titled Storm, Hurricane Signs. And here, as opposed to relying on traditional science or meteorology, this list contains various types of folklore about how you can use the natural world to signal that a hurricane is coming. Some of the examples include chickens standing with their bodies to the wind for several days, shifting behavior in rattlesnakes and copperheads, along with fish coming to the surface and, quote, sticking out their nose. This list coincides with Naylor's handwritten list of the flora and fauna that will populate the fictional island, demonstrating that not only are the residents of Willow Springs in community with each other in terms of scrutinizing documents from the main side, but the residents of Willow Springs are also in a non-hierarchical collaboration with non-human species as producers of knowledge as well, that teach us how to, quote, how to sustain Black life and anticipate crises that would shape Black life, including natural disasters like the hurricane. One of the last things, I know I said that was the last thing, but this is the last thing that I want to share is that Naylor not only draws this folkloric knowledge from Eva McKinney, who is her grandmother's best friend, but she does her own archival research, particularly in the Journal of American Folklore. And there's one particular issue that I do want to highlight for you that you'll find, that I found interesting, and that I'm hoping that you'll find interesting as well. Naylor went back to volumes of the Journal of American Folklore going back to the late 19th century. And if you look in those documents, in those copy pages, she has notes, she leaves marginalia that says which hexes will be included in the novel, which rituals will be included in the novel. And there's one in particular that I do want to share with you as a kind of final ending talking point. This is from an edition of the Journal of American Folklore, Hoodoo in America from 1931. And this particular issue was edited by Zora Neale Hurston, who was using her own Southern ethnographic studies to talk about various Afro-descendant practices, both in the Southern United States and in the Caribbean. So here we see the connection between Hurston and Naylor and Black women's the way their literary work exceeds the boundaries of the nation state, and the way they're already thinking concurrently between the United States and the Caribbean. And in this particular document, she leaves a note in the marginalia that said, the day's graveyard. And in this particular part of the text, it says, it is well known that church members are buried with their feet to the east, so that they will rise on the last day facing the rising sun. Sinners are buried facing on the opposite direction. The theory is that sunlight will do them harm rather than good, as they will no doubt wish to hide their faces from an angry God. And I wanted to kind of use this as a last piece to talk about, because Naylor is not only concerned with the living, but she's also concerned with the dead. And I think that that's one of the archival practices that we need to think about, particularly in this contemporary moment, but all moments, is how do our archival practices, how do our knowledge practices, which are spiritual practices, also honor and pay homage to the dead. and also blurs that kind of Western binaristic boundary that says the living and the dead are so separate, right? So what I'll close by saying in terms of the kind of question that Jamie offered us in the beginning about what are some of the kind of contemporary resonances that we can gather from Naylor's archive, is that Naylor's archive, with respect to Mom and Dad and many other texts that have been shared today, documents both crisis and survival. Naylor uses a host of methods to redefine what might constitute the literary. Naylor creates a fictional world that resists profit-driven value and instead creates an ecology that's sustainable for Black living and the dead to dwell. Thank you.
Wow. I'm at a loss for words. Let me make sure I put it in speaker view so everyone can, gallery view, excuse me. Wow, what, I can't even bring in words. Like, people are on Twitter saying such excellent, are giving wonderful remarks and comments. And I just want to, like, you know, provide a list of kind of like what everyone said during this conversation and how revolutionary and radical Naylor really was, and at the vanguard of so many different themes and topics that we are seeing today. So people talked about displacement, transnational Black feminists, relationships. I didn't even know about hoodoo and conjure and African spirituality, and, you know, honoring the living as well as the dead, you know, because so much of our history as Black people has been erased or relegated to the sidelines, or interrogated via the lens of white capitalists, supremacists, patriarchal, cis heteronormative revisionist histories, right? Talked about mass incarceration and policing, colonial rule, capitalism. I mean, y'all really did the damn thing. I mean, I'm so grateful for this conversation because it puts Gloria Naylor, oftentimes I feel with Black women's literary works, we have our top 5 or our top 10, or we only go towards certain people who are more popular, but we don't interrogate other Black women writers who were also critical to this literary canon, right? Not just in women's radical traditions, but also just in Black political thought or literary thought, and literary canonical works in general. So I am just blown away by this conversation. So thank you so much. And we have tons of questions, by the way. And so we do have about 20 minutes. I know we don't want to belabor our panelists and our these amazing scholars, but people have questions. And so what I'll do is ask the questions, and also you can see them in the Q&A function, but then I'll also go off screen to allow you to answer these questions, and you'll only hear my voice because I really want the spotlight to be on you all and your amazing work. So, whew, I got to get over myself. I was taking notes over here, trying to, you know, monitor all the chats, but being selfish and taking my own notes. So about 2 people asked the same question, but Sam Sorensen, forgive me if I'm saying your name incorrectly, but they asked, in addition to the amazing work presented here, what is an item from the archive that excites you, bring you joy, or you just love? A question for everyone. And I'm also wondering about Ayana as the GA responsible for processing materials. And I'll also put that question in the chat.
I'll jump in here. I think there are so many that come to mind. Obviously, like working in the archive every day, I see so many things. Because I've been working with the processing since in my time here, with the processing, with the correspondence in my time here. The items that jump out to me are the letters between Gloria Naylor and other Black women writers. Lucille Clifton, Terry Jewell, Terry McMillan, Ann Petrie, Nikki Giovanni, you know, they were really conversing about literature in really interesting ways, pouring into one another, and just creating a network amongst each other that is just really beautiful to see. I think as a Black woman who writes, it is just so encouraging to see that in Gloria Naylor's archive, and makes me think of my friends who are writers who I talk about writing with. And so that's something that just really gives me joy. Every time I come across it, I'm so excited. So yeah, it's not one item, but it's many. And I'm so grateful every time I get to see something like that.
Thank you so much. And if anyone else wants to share what their favorite, yeah. Marandy, did you want to go?
Yeah, I'll go next. There's so many things to love, but one of the things that cracks me up every time is some of the letters that Gloria Naylor would get from people who read her books, particularly about Mama Day. And part of it has to do with the fact there were so many letters. I don't want to be a spoiler, but a very prominent character in Mama Day dies. I won't say who it is, but a very prominent character dies in Mama Day. And she got so many letters from people who said, you know, I started this book and couldn't put it down, or when this happened to this character, I bawled my eyes out, I couldn't stop crying. And also, and I think Suzanne mentioned this as well, so many people were looking forward to that novel becoming a film. And so I think to kind of see the way that her literature was touching people, the way that they were so engrossed in the literary world that she created, and the strong desire to see it on film, and the excitement about who was cast. It's a very famous literary figure. I won't say their name, but they wrote a letter, and they were saying, you know, I see Denzel as George. So it was a lot of excitement about the literary world that Naylor was created, in the way she was hoping to translate that to the cinematic world. And I really am happy to see that she got those flowers and knew the real joy that people felt about her work.
Maybe I'll jump in after Randy, because people are focusing on the letters, and Randy focused on the letters, and Ayanna. And I think for me too, that the letters are really moving parts of the archive. And I especially like some exchanges that she received from Black lesbian fans in relationship to the Women of Brewster Place. Those were really wonderful to read, because Naylor was so generous in responding to fans' questions about why did there have to be sexual violence at the end of Brewster Place? Why were lesbian characters attacked? And she just took pages and pages to talk about her vision in that novel. You also can get a sense in the letters from, I'm thinking about one letter in particular from a Black lesbian fan, how important Women of Brewster Place was at that time period, how important the miniseries was, because it represented Black queer people and Black lesbians in particular. And she really took the time to respond with love and care to people that wrote to her. So while she has famous writers, she also was so generous with her readers and people that were deeply impacted and moved by her novels. And so those are archival moments that are really moving, you know, for me to read those letters from fans.
Well, I think for me, if you ask me tomorrow, I'll probably have a different answer. But for today, I'm thinking particularly, I'm really interested in the moments where she starts to think about the structures of her novels. And they're usually like early notes that she's taking. And for Bailey's Café, she said many times in interviews and other places that she saw Bailey's Café as a jazz performance. And of course, the sections of the novel, there's the vamp, the blues, it's organized according to blues structures. But what's interesting about this sort of just like one page of notes, like she always took on that lined legal paper, that imagines each of the performers as a different instrument. And that's not something that makes it into the book, but it's something that's part of her creative process. She envisions, one character playing the clarinet, another playing the horn. And, it's just like, and what that captures for me about Naylor's work is the way in which she is constantly envisioning her art across different forms: literary, theatrical, musical, filmic. She really has a sort of multi-format vision for everything that she's doing.
I'll just say quickly, I was looking at the journal entries, and I think one of the things that struck me is so often with Black artists, the bar is way too low or way too high. So if it doesn't, if the work doesn't solve systemic racism, then it failed. Or if it says something, anything about a subject that particularly white readers don't know, then okay, it must be fine. And so there's this really weird kind of situation that Black writers find themselves in, and that and it's hard to win in the situation and to be an artist. And I love seeing her kind of battle with that and fight with those ideas, that she was doing some good and hard and interesting work, but she also wanted to tell the stories of these individuals. I mean, she was aiming for truth and justice and reform and the things that art does when it's doing its best job. But she also wanted to tell these individual stories, and so she just kind of threw out this whole dynamic that we often have about what the Black artist can do.
Wow, I'm getting excited all over again. These comments, I'm telling you, people are so excited. So the next question is by Monet Timmons. Forgive me if I'm saying your name incorrectly, but you asked a wonderful question. Monet said, "Thank you so much for these amazing presentations. Can you all talk about what it means for Black women to record, collect, and document their lives in the 20th century, and how this practice is a part of a longer tradition of Black women archivists? I'm thinking about Naylor's intention to keep and donate certain documents to control her own narrative while also telling the narratives of other Black women." And I also put this question in the chat. Don't be scared, y'all. Anyone could go now.
I'll say something in terms of Black women writers. So many of them were archivists. So I think for me in doing this work and having been able to spend time with Naylor's papers, Toni Cade Bambar's papers, Audre Lorde's papers, and also having people share materials with me from other people's papers. So many Black women literary figures were archivists. They were documenting national stories about Black life, local stories about Black life. Thinking about somebody like Toni Cade Bambara and the ways that she's documented the Atlanta child murders, material upon material upon material. But the thing that I think that is really important, I guess, about that practice is the way that we kind of expand our definitions of who's an archivist, who's a historian, who can do historical work. And I think that Black women writers, particularly, Naylor's contemporaries in that moment, I'm sure there are others, were constantly kind of blurring that boundary between artist and intellectual, historian, literary figure. And I think that for me is kind of the exciting thing about Black women in archives, particularly these literary figures. Somebody like Naylor, the depth of her research just for Mama Day is outstanding. Like there's a character who is a bee handler and she has books on bee handling, like a character who likes football. She has the playoffs of that year mapped out. Like, I think it's just a certain kind of meticulousness and care that they take with the materials. And I think it asks us to be more capacious in our understanding of knowledge production at a time where a lot of those categories are being shrunk and foreclosed to only include certain types of people and certain types of methods. So that's what I would say.
And I'll just add something small, which is I think, we can see in the archive, I think, how Naylor starts to think of herself as an archivist at the same time that she becomes a writer. That the earliest documents in the archive are right from that moment when Women of Brewster Place gets published. I think that's why she saves both the outgoing and the incoming correspondence. I think anybody who has ever worked with correspondence in an archive knows often you only have one half of the conversation. So to me, there's a sense in which she's really self-consciously thinking about leaving these records, leaving that trail of materials to trace, trace the conversations that we might otherwise hear only from one side. And I think also about the part of your question that's about sort of like the question of controlling her own narrative. I do really think donating her materials to Sacred Heart University is part of an effort to control her own narrative. She was friends with Michelle Loris there, who is still there and has collaborated with us on this project. And I think donating them there was a part of knowing that there was this person there who had supported Naylor's career, had edited an early book on some of her works. And, I think it was she donated it at a time when she could have sold. I think she could have easily sold the papers somewhere else, but really made a conscious decision to donate them to a place where, that's not a place you would typically think of as housing a huge amount of Black women's writers' archives. In fact, this is the only one there.
Maybe I'll just add to both of these comments by Randy and Suzanne that we've had a lot of conversations with the Naylor Advisory Board and through the archival process about really thinking about what the archives reveal and what we know from Michelle Loris and those that have been there when the archives arrived at Sacred Heart University. Thinking a lot about what Naylor hoped for her archives, even though we cannot know exactly what that is. But how do you create archives that are open in the ways that she really wanted her works to be open, so that it isn't exclusive, locked away in an institution where fans can't access it and it's only available to researchers? How can it be accessible and open? We've really had those kinds of conversations. And I think it's important to have those conversations in the context of academic institutions that have collect Black women writers' papers, but then not processed them. There's a book that Suzanne had sort of shared with me called Shadow Archives by Jean-Christophe Cloutier, which really talks about this incredible collection practice of Black writers' papers, but then institutions like Yale and other institutions not processing those papers. And he actually in that book had then found a manuscript from Ann Petrie that had been sort of lost and not processed. And one of the arguments he makes in that book is that collection isn't enough, beyond collection processing, and then really kind of aligning archival practice with authorial wishes or authorial kind of ethics around who those archives are for, how they were collected, who they focus upon, et cetera. And some of Randy's work, I think, really shows us who Naylor was thinking about in terms of building her archives, who she was depending on to build those archives, what communities she cared about. So then how can archivists make those materials accessible to the communities that helped to build them, that Naylor worked with to build them? So those are some of the larger kinds of questions that I think this powerful question posed from an attendee really gets at. How are archives being made accessible? Are they accessible to the communities from which they were built, the communities that authors cared for? But this question is at, I think, the heart of a really important conversation in archival studies.
Definitely, and your responses also answer Erica and Sadet's questions on safeguarding Naylor's archives and adhering to Naylor's wishes and principles. And one of the things I love about the Gloria Naylor Archive and you all is that when I had a discussion with Suzanne and Ayana, we really went into who has access to archives. And I shared a story about how I went to a certain university and I couldn't even have access to those archives when they refused me. I won't say the name, but they refused me. Meanwhile, at Howard, it's very easy. You can easily access Moreland Spingards archives. You show an ID. I don't know if things have changed, but at the time it was easier to access. And it was this Ivy League institution refused me. And I was just like, how do I reclaim Black archives? How do we do that as a community? How do we have access to our histories? How do we go back and get our histories when we're continuously blocked or ostracized or overlooked or seen as outsiders, even while we are in academia? And so what I appreciate about this conversation is you all discuss this, and Gloria Naylor was keen on this, and thank you for honoring her wishes. So we're at the 5:50 mark. I know everyone's tired. I just want to honor that. But there was one question that Carlos had. I don't know if anyone can, there's two questions we can wrap up really quickly. So first, Carlos asked, in Linden Hills, Reverend Hollis lives on 5th Crescent Drive. The next address is 722 Tupelo. Do any of the documents in the archive mention the omission of the 6th road or address? I don't even, I'll leave that to.
I mean, I'm sure it's important. Definitely, I can't speak to that question directly, but definitely there are huge numerological calculations in the archives. It's not unusual to see her sort of sketching out, if there's 49 square miles on Willow Springs, what does that mean for exactly what goes where? She definitely thought carefully about numerological things. And I don't think any of us it might well be there but we haven't looked for it, so.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And lastly, Ayana, this question goes to you. So Ayana, the anonymous attendee asked, Ayana, forgive me if you mentioned this earlier. You said that you wish you had access to the whole book. Is that story unfinished, or does it appear that there are missing pages/chapters?
Sure, that's a great question. So we only have the first 2 sections of Saphira Wade. Those could be the only sections of Saphira Wade, for all we know. Naylor didn't indicate whether there was more or not. She could have written more and not chosen to share all of it, right, as the person who was curating her own collection. So it's kind of a mystery. I don't know if maybe Suzanne has more information, but we don't really know at the time. I think I can say pretty confidently. We can only hope that one day we will discover it, because I know personally I want the rest of that story. So.
Well, I mean, we could also go here, I think, to the question that Erica Edwards asked, which is, and I'm just going to read what she said. Naylor said about Sapphira Wade that she wasn't going to write the novel after her 1996 experience. She didn't feel like Sapphira, the character, was safe. And when she gave the archive, there is no story about Sapphira. There is certainly significant amount of research material that Naylor had collected with an eye toward telling that story. That research material is annotated in much the way that Randy pointed out about the piece from the American Folklore Journal. Yeah, I think there's no way, I don't know, but I do think, the question that Dr. Edwards asks about whether we see her safeguarding her archive, I absolutely think we do see that. We see it in a couple of different ways. I mean, in some places we see her offering her interpretation or explanation of why she kept something. Like, I mean, one of my favorite ones of those, she writes, I just cut this letter to show you the kind of foolishness I get but don't keep. That kind of thing. And I think too, like, definitely she left things out. There can be no question of that she made careful, conscious decisions about what she was going to include, which suggests that she made careful, conscious decisions about what she was not going to include. So, yeah, and I think one of the questions where we wrestle with is, how do we safeguard this material in ways that are consistent with her wishes? And I mean, I think those questions arise, as far as we can understand them, from close reading her books, from close reading the document the deed of gift to Sacred Heart. But, those questions arise particularly around digitization, and a lot of the anxiety in, a lot of her observations in 1996 about surveillance, and what we know now about digital surveillance of Black people in the United States. We've been very cautious with digitizing for that reason. That is password protected still, so that it can't be harvested by search engines, although we can provide access and will provide access to anyone who specifically wants to see it. Please ask us. Please write to me, and Ayana is who you'll get, and visit the website. Please come to the symposium, come to the archive. We're excited to share this with you, and we're excited to hear from you about what you're doing.
Yes, Randy, did you want to say something to follow up?
Yeah, I just wanted to answer Dr. Edwards' questions about other ways we see her safeguarding materials. One of the things about the Eva McKinney interview that's interesting is that Naylor goes on to write like a published essay about Eva McKinney, and what's in that essay versus what's in the transcript is not the same. There's quite a bit of material that she leaves out about Eva McKinney's life. And I think that is a deliberate choice. Even some of the ways that Naylor in the interview responds to stories about conjure, stories about a frog jumping out of someone's leg. She doesn't say, oh, this is crazy, or I'm not going to engage this. She treats it as knowledge. She engages it ethically, but she also doesn't put that in the publication that's going out for wider circulation. She does interviews with two elder Black women in Robinsonville, Mississippi, who live together. One who says, as long as I have a corner, she has a corner. I'm going to make sure she's taken care of, right? These very kind of tender moments that did not appear in the actual publication that Naylor circulated. So I think that there is a way that she very much attends to Black women, elders, and ancestors via omission that doesn't assume that their the exposure of their interior lives is a inherently liberatory act. And so that would be one of the ways I think that she safeguards materials and Black women's lives in her writing. So I just wanted to share that.
I'm just in awe of everyone's brilliance at this point. I need to take a course immediately from all y'all on Gloria Naylor. But I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for your amazing work and scholarship, for doing this. I know things are rough for everyone, and I just appreciate everyone so much for sharing your knowledge about this wonderful woman, wonderful Black woman writer, who we should honor and revere at all times. And so to Suzanne, Ayana, Stephanie, Mary, and Randy, thank you so much. And I know our audience is saying thank you to you all in the comments, and I just appreciate it. And hopefully we did Gloria Naylor, or y'all did Gloria Naylor justice today. And I hope she's smiling down on us. Thank you so much. Is there anything else anyone would like to add, to plug before we round up or end the conversation? Just if you want to plug an event or anything, just feel free. And if not, we can just end the conversation too. Yes, someone said check out the archive. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. This is beautiful. And I hope you each have a chance to teach a workshop on this. So thank you once again, and have a great evening, everyone. Thank you. Bye.